Generally in the discussion there's three broad scenarios which are mapped out as to what might happen in the future. Either the current difficulties, which are all too numerous to be worth listing by me, and you'll hear about them from our panelists. Either these difficulties are the teething problems of a very complex and ambitious project, made by errors, no doubt, but that there are things which could be reformed over time in order eventually to stabilise and bring the sort of success that the architects of the Eurozone had in mind. So there's a benign scenario. Or secondly, the flaws are so deep, so endemic, so structural to the makeup of the Eurozone that they will fester to the point of eventual collapse and the breakup of the Eurozone in some form. And there's been plenty of discussion of people saying, well, perhaps it's not the obvious candidate, Greece, that should leave, or Italy that should leave, perhaps Germany should leave with a block of people. Maybe there's other ways that we should try to proceed. And the third scenario is based on the reality that the Eurozone's been going for 17 years now, and it's been going for 6-7 years since it began to manifest the problems of the aftermath of the financial crash. And it has proven its resilience and its staying power. And perhaps the third scenario is that it can continue to muddle through as it has done reasonably effectively, move on from crisis to crisis, but that there's too much behind it now for anyone to risk it falling apart. So those are the three broad scenarios. I'm not saying they sum up what the panel will be talking about, but that gives hopefully a flavour of what is being discussed out there. So to discuss all this, we have Christian May, and this is the order they'll be speaking. Christian is the editor of London's daily business newspaper, City A.M. For those of you not in London, should know is, certainly in my opinion, a must-read for anyone who wants to keep up with economic, financial, business news in London, not just for the editorials, which I don't know if Christian writes or delegates, but a very valuable sort of two-page opinion section is a must-read in terms of different ideas on some of the key issues facing the business and financial and economic community. Christian was previously head of communications and campaigns at the Institute of Directors, which most of you may know is Britain's largest organisation for business leaders. Then we have Professor Keith Pilbeam. He's published extensively on his main specialist research areas of international economics and finance, so he's obviously hugely well qualified for this topic. And he's professor of the same subjects at two London institutions, City University of London and Cass Business School. He also teaches abroad at Boston University, and he's been a visiting professor at the European University Institute in Florence. So he's been on the ground, not just in Europe and Britain, but around the world. Finally, we have Bruno Waterfield, former reporter for the Daily Telegraph, where he was Brussels correspondent for a decade, I think, and he now occupies the same position at the Times, and he's a frequent speaker at Institute of Ideas events on matters variously to do with Europe, but also beyond that. So on that, I will invite my speakers to give their opening comments, standard format, 5-7 minutes each, and then over to you and continue the conversation.
Does the Eurozone have a future? I believe the answer is yes, alas. I expect it does. The reason is because when its architects and proponents say that they will do whatever it takes to sustain it, I think we should believe them. By way of context, I think it's just worth noting how poor the conditions within the Eurozone are at the moment. Just before the election, The Economist published, as it does every 5 years, its 5-year EU forecast. It was pretty grim reading. It basically said that the next 5 years will be characterised by the same set of circumstances and conditions as the last 5 years, by which it meant suboptimal policy responses to suboptimal growth, social and economic conditions, and political fragmentation. Those are the conditions that currently make up much of the foundation of the Eurozone. And indeed, Mr. Juncker, Jean-Claude Juncker's recent State of the Union address, which sounded to my mind like a eulogy for someone who wasn't very popular, talked about how he had never known a time across Europe of such political fragmentation and of such divergent national interests. I think that what we have to recognise here is that the Eurozone constitutes what is deemed by many to be the economic necessity of a deeply political project. And it's that political project and the drive to sustain it which will keep the Eurozone afloat. There is, I think, a recognition that in order to do that, it requires much deeper fiscal and political integration, which I expect would come up against, if it isn't already, a fair degree of popular and democratic objection, as well it should. If one looks at the recent comments of the first chief economist of the ECB, Otmar Issing, who talked about, on current trajectory and inevitability, that the House of Cards, as he put it, will collapse. He talked, and I quote, that realistically it will be a case of muddling through, of struggling on, although this state of affairs cannot go on endlessly. That phrase, muddling on, which also was essentially the conclusion of the Economist's 5-year projection, also now the opinion of the first chief economist of the ECB, they're going to muddle on through high levels of debt, high levels of unemployment, and a political fatigue. Issing continued that the bailout clause has been violated every day. And the reason for that is because, as I mentioned, it is an innately political project. And so it will be shaped according to the political desires of its current proponent and architects. And in order to survive, there is going to have to be, as many people are now speculating, further integration that will include, perhaps, an EU treasury, more fiscal integration, and, as I mentioned, I believe these are notions that will be resisted at a democratic level, and so they should be. So there is a central irony here, which is that the constant political interference and the political shaping of an economic condition has taken the Eurozone to a point where only more of that sort of political integration could possibly sustain it, and it lacks a democratic consent. Jacques Delors, whose institute, the Delors Institute, has also just published it's a diagnosis and a prescription for survival, has talked about the need for supranational economic government, of debt pooling, of pan-EU treasury. And again, I would question where the democratic consent for those measures would come from. It is essentially the European Union becoming a transfer zone where wealthy and successful economies will prop up less wealthy and less successful economies. I do not consider that to be a sustainable trajectory. So I think that proponents of the single currency will tell you that it wasn't meant to be like this, that they've come through crisis and that they are now seeking to move forward. Some people will say that the seeds of the crisis were planted within the very founding concepts of the project. The advocates of closer union will tell you that now is the time to plough forward with the integration project, both politically and fiscally. But I suspect that the people of Europe, as and when they get opportunities to express their view on this, will possibly tell you something else. So I would say that, simply put, yes, the Eurozone has a future. I don't think it's a rosy one. I think it's a deeply uncertain one, driven by almost maniacal political necessity. And I think it's one that we should be grateful that we will not be a member of, though we would be kidding ourselves if we think we would be immune from the next inevitable crisis. A crisis which will emerge, maybe in 6 months or 6 years, and even the project's very architects can see that in its current form it would not be able to weather such a crisis, which is why now the clamour is for much, much further and deeper integration, which is a part of the political project with which I feel uncomfortable.
Thank you. I think that very well sort of disabuses any idea that we're talking about a narrow economic question. I think Christian's very much put it in the political context. There's a political issue here which goes way beyond the economics of the dysfunctionality of it. Okay, Keith.
I actually am a big fan of the euro, and I'm an unashamed fan, and that may shock a few people, but let's remember what it was designed to do. It was to complete the single market. I mean, you had this single market project in 1986, and it was completed by 1992, and it was to get rid of non-tariff barriers. And the idea was fairly simple. This is why it got resurrected as an idea, was that a single market needs a single currency to reduce the transaction costs for businesses, not to worry about foreign exchange risk, And people forget that. And that was the idea. It was an economic idea to serve a better integrated single market. And the single market has been very prosperous. And I very much regret that we may be leaving that single market. So that's the first thing. People use it on a daily basis. Now, what I remember is that it was democratically put through. Even in the Houses of Parliament, we were dragging people, and I think it got through by one vote. But we approved, we got our opt-out, so, that's the way it worked. And it was democratically approved. Every country had to approve it. It's one of those things that Europe has to do. You have to have unanimity on these kind of things, just like you need unanimity for new entrants and things like that. So we get a lot of misinformation. Now, what was its job? Its job was to be a sound currency. That's what the Germans wanted. And I don't blame them. All right? You had a nice Deutschmark. You hardly want to give it up for a crappy Italian lira, is the way I put it to my students. So I think fundamentally they did try to put some economics foundations in place. Now, we know that those foundations were a bit more wobbly. All right? So the first mistake, they introduced the Maastricht Treaty. And it had all these conditions like you've got to get your inflation down, get your budget deficits down. And again, they did write into the rules, if your national debt is more than 60% of GDP, you are not qualified to be a member. Okay, so that was one of the rules, which they conveniently, of course, got rid of. What they woke up a little bit because there was lots of rules about before you join and no rules about after you join. All right, so suddenly the Greeks were getting their fiscal deficits down, through creative accounting, let's call it that. And they then realised that they needed some fiscal rules because obviously it's no good having membership criteria and then when you're a member, what do you do? And so they did actually try to do something, actually, and it was called the Stability and Growth Pact, which basically was that if your budget deficits were bigger than 3% of GDP, then you couldn't become a member. All right, so it was the idea that, of course, we didn't want, because with a single currency, you don't want just countries piling up debt and then ultimately, the others being liable for it. But a lot of people also forget that in that Maastricht Treaty, there was a thing called the no bailout clause, which basically, I'm not a lawyer, but it said that countries are not jointly and severally liable for the debts of the other countries. So that was clearly in there. It wasn't advertised. All right, and I wish it had been advertised because what it says to me is buyer beware. In other words, if you go and buy Greek debt or lend to the Greek government, then that's your own risk. All right? Now, I've never bought Greek debt and I never intend to. All right? So what we know, though, is that once the currency got going, French and German banks went and bought Greek debt like crazy at ridiculously low interest rates. That's what they did. And so we ended up not bailing out Greece. This is what people forget. We ended up bailing out French and German banks. All right? But that was, so the Germans obviously had to come along to a rescue for Greece. They had to because their own banks had lent them money. So who do I blame? Well, I blame partly the politicians for letting in countries they shouldn't have, but I also blame banks that absolutely were reckless in lending money to some of these countries at ridiculously low interest rates. As we know, it always used to be a puzzle why you'd look up a 10-year government bond yield in Germany and it would read 5%, and then for Greece it was reading 5.2% in the run-up to the crisis, like 20 basis points, nothing. And now that's not how you price risk. Now, I never bought Greek debt. I didn't ask for a bailout. I was clever enough to realise for 0.2%, it wasn't a good deal. So they also set up the European Central Bank. Now, it was basically modelled on the Bundesbank. Yeah, and its job, rightly so, was to keep inflation low in the Eurozone. And actually, it hasn't done a bad job, okay? Because they didn't want it to be like the Banca d'Italia or the Bank of Greece, printing money to, rescue the government with its fiscal excesses. So the framework was put in place. It wasn't a perfect framework, as we quickly learnt a few years later, but that was also a financial crisis, the like of which I can't recall in my lifetime, came along. and it exposed some of the things that had gone wrong. So my point is that it was intended to be a decent currency, and in general it has. And these countries, let's remember what currencies they used to have. I used to joke about the Spanish potato, I used to call it in my lectures to get a few laughs. It was, of course, the Spanish potato, the Italian drachma, the dreadful Italian lira. These were the currencies that they had, and I'm not surprised they wanted to find something better, all right? And they did find something better, and it was called the euro. Believe it or not, I believe, because I believe the route they were on, as I discussed briefly, was they were on the road to Zimbabwe in Greece. You see, you look at Greece, look, it's been dreadful. I'm not saying that, but what was the cause of the problem? Was it the fact that they had the euro, or the fact that they ran up two big fiscal deficits, no one was being taxed, and they were spending money left, right and centre on all sorts of dodgy employment and things like that? So that a lot of the problems of Greece, I'm afraid, it might not be a popular message, rests with the Greeks themselves, not the euro. In fact, the euro has made it clear that that's the problems you've got. All right, now they have to collect taxes. Now they have to cut government expenditure and stop some of the wasteful bureaucrats being employed, with multiple jobs and things like that, retiring at the age of 50. I mean, it's a joke of a way to run your country. Now they're beginning to get better, and the euro deserves some credit for that. All right, and so my feeling is that a lot of these problems are not per se the euro, and of course it's the easy scapegoat. We've got fundamental problems in all sorts of countries, and the euro actually has proved a pretty good thing. The Chinese like it as well. They don't just want an American dollar as the sole currency. We need a euro. We need a rival to the dollar, and I think it provides an adequate one.
That was wonderful, Keith. Obviously, a sterling defence of it as an institution, despite all the problems which have been, and very helpfully cutting through some of the myths and mythology that's grown up around the history of the last 17 years. So thank you very much, Keith. And finally, Bruno.
Really, the only thing the Eurozone can boast about is that it hasn't collapsed yet. That's a very, very dubious claim to success. It's come at quite a price. Does the euro have a future? Yes, sadly so, although it's amid real pessimism. I can't understate the degree of pessimism you have in this institution called the Euro Working Group and in DG ECFIN, in the European Commission. Should the euro have a future? No. That's my argument. When the euro was created, it's worth going back sometimes to look at the sort of euphoria, the extravagant claims that were made for this single currency. It was supposed to create an economy that would rival the United States, do much more than just bring down transaction costs, but actually rival the United States. It was supposed to help less developed European economies, that was the appeal for countries like Italy, weather storms and catch up with Germany or France. It was also, as Delors pitched it, supposed to be a shield defending the European social model, high welfare, good pension deals, against the American model, bad welfare, low wages, no pension deals. The euro doesn't rival the United States. It hasn't helped defend the European social model. Moreover, it has created greater economic inequalities between its member countries. And we saw during the crisis, and we're still seeing now, it shifted the burden of paying for the crisis from the rich north to the poor south. It has actually created a world-beating no-growth or slow-growth zone where productivity is falling in relationship to the United States. In terms of productivity, Eurozone countries are worse off than before the euro. Between 1995 and 2013, the last year the Commission did a report on a measure called the total productivity factor. Productivity has fallen by 10%. In 1995, Eurozone countries in aggregate had productivity at 90% of the US rate. Today, it's 80% and falling. The Commission, who tend to optimism, forecast that in 2023, productivity will be 73% of the level in the US. It hasn't worked, full stop. It's failed to do that. In that time, the European social model, which you can criticise, but it had a pretty high degree of legitimacy among European voters, has been largely dismantled. So one of the big promises also that was made by the euro was unemployment floor. A lot of European economies have long been dogged by high unemployment rates. The euro was going to lift everyone and unemployment was going to fall. And it looked pretty good in those days of asset bubbles when German bonds were retailing for almost the same price as Greek bonds. In 2000 and 2007, it fell to around 7% on average unemployment across the Eurozone. It's now at 10.1%, and there are no signs of it falling. There are no signs of it reaching pre-crisis levels. In the United States, unemployment is 5%. It's half the level of the Eurozone. The Eurozone has failed there. Within the Eurozone, there are very big differences on unemployment. The unemployment rate in Germany is 4.2%. It's 23.4%. In Greece, it's 19.5% is Spain. So the euro certainly isn't evening out inequality within the economies of its member states. The youth unemployment figures are still actually shocking. Almost a decade in to this crisis, they really do show the inequality that's building up between the Eurozone member states, and it's actually having a pretty grim social toll. In August this year, the lowest rate of youth unemployment in Germany was 6.9%. In Greece, it was 47.7%. In Spain, it was 43.2%. And in Italy, 38.8% youth unemployment. This has always also been a period of intense structural reform in many Eurozone countries and real changes to the European social model that for many Italians, particularly Spaniards, French people and others, was the real accomplishment of their post-war grandparents and parents. So these changes have been really unpopular and still they're not working. Perhaps the worst element, I think, of the Eurozone that we've seen in terms of what's actually going on is how the countries most affected by the crisis are recovering the most slowly and carrying the heaviest burden. So look at Greece. Look at Spain, particularly. I think the situation in Spain is really shocking. Really, really shocking. Speak to some of the guys who are working in bars around London who've left their families behind in Spain and are working on a minimum wage to send money home so that their families can keep their head above water. The other thing that I find actually makes me really angry about the euro as a sort of concept is there's no way out. There is no way out of the euro, and people boast about it. Mario Draghi, the president of the European Bank, is fond of putting it, the euro is irreversible. Irreversible. This is a failed political institutions in the affairs of man that cannot be undone, says Mario Draghi. I find this a completely unique conjuncture. In the 1930s, a crisis prompted very radical changes to statecraft and the ideas around economic policy and debates about what the economy was for and who benefits. In the second decade of the 21st century, the ECB, the institution most exposed in the crisis, insists that it is irreversible. Angela Merkel, the German economy, frequently asserts the Eurozone is alternativlos, or without alternative. So what about reform? What about the elusive political union that will fix the euro? It's just not going to happen. Underneath all the pious bullshit about peace projects, there is a really unpalatable, indigestible, irrevocable truth. Europe's peoples, particularly after the crisis, simply do not accept that they should take on the debts of other countries or surrender to diktats cutting their living standards, abolishing, scrapping their social model from external foreign bodies such as the European Commission, the ECB or the IMF. I cannot think of a single European nation or people who enthusiastically embrace the idea that the EU in Brussels or Frankfurt should be able to dictate to them how they spend the national wealth that they earned, or instruct them to share it or transfer it to Greeks Spaniards or others. Yet that is the trajectory we are told the Eurozone needs to survive. The Euro is on the wrong side of history. It should have no future.
Can we thank our three panellists, please? And a sterling presentation of the case against. Okay, over to you.
I haven't heard anyone explain to me why the Eurozone is an economic failure. I've heard a lot of data and statistics of bad results, but no one's explained to me why it would be worse, why it is worse than it would be if we didn't have the Eurozone. The second point is the first speaker started by saying that this is a political project. And again, I've heard that extensively over the last 2 days. I don't understand that. In my mind, the purpose of setting up the EU was for the more powerful countries in Europe to extract greater value from the overall geography of Europe. That was the purpose of it. And it has given some benefits to the smaller countries, and it's also put them in debt. But no one's explained to me here the reason why countries in Europe would get together for a political reason if there wasn't an economic reason behind it. In my mind, the Eurozone is an economic initiative, but the politics has come along later and tried to explain that, and it hasn't explained it very well. And even in this session today, I'd ask you to treat us with a bit more respect. Rather than tell us it's terrible and become emotional, explain to me why it's a bad idea. You haven't done that.
Actually, a very closely related question. I was wondering whether the panel thought that the euro was flawed ab initio, or whether we've got into this mess as a result of a series of unforced errors. And I'm thinking particularly of the decision to let Greece in the first place that was mentioned from the panel, but also the decision by the ECB in 2011 to raise interest rates during a recession.
I enjoyed the presentations very much, and particularly Bruno's point. I completely understand. I mean, maybe I've travelled to Greece a lot in my work and to Mediterranean countries. I mean, what's happening there is a human tragedy. I mean, to us, it just seems like a statistic. But a recession over the last 6 or 7 years is not a very nice thing to have to live through. And I appreciate the fact that you have the statistics with the 43% and 47% of youth unemployment. That's real. It's a tragedy. The question I wanted to ask is, to Keith, you mentioned the fact that it's the Greeks' problem, but the euro enabled them to borrow the money. I mean, I remember drachma days. I worked in a bank. If they wanted to borrow 10-year money, it would cost them 12%. That was a disincentive to borrow the money. It was when they went to the euro that the capital market became much broader and the interest rates on 10-year money, on 20-year money, were much shallower. And just to finish up, what I would say is that if you have lower interest rates, your incentive should be to borrow less because you're a better borrower. But what they did was that once the borrowing costs went down, they simply doubled up on their borrowing. So what had cost them 10% now costs them, let's say, 3%. They just trebled their debt. And that's what the euro allowed them to do. And on drachma days, in lira days, we can laugh at those currencies, but they were flexible enough in terms of interest rates and the rate at which they traded to prevent them getting into this debt trap that they have done.
Thank you. So looking at some of the drawbacks of having a single interest rate.
So I'm not an economist, but I do live in Portugal. I have lived there for the last 6 years, employed by the Portuguese government as an academic. I thought it is a tragedy. It has been a tragedy. I mean, I know we're not really supposed to talk about Brexit, but when you think of all the young Portuguese people who are over here in London working because they can't get a job in Portugal, you can see the kind of dynamics of the tragedy, both for Portugal and it could be a tragedy for England as well when they lose all this good labour. But I think what I really want to say, I think there is an answer, although I'm not an economist, I think there is an answer to the gentleman in black over there, which is it seems to be no intrinsic dynamic within the Eurozone to actually correct the problem. That's the real nub of where we are. So when you live in Portugal at the moment, what it seems like is, although the Troika no longer run Portugal officially, they have done for 4 or 5 years before that, it seems like your country is run by people outside. For a long time, many people in Portugal thought, our politicians are so bad, it's better that those people in Brussels run it for us. But increasingly, that is not a widely held opinion. But the problem is that it's what I think Bruno was sort of gesturing towards. It's the sort of Jean-Paul Sartre no exit strategy. You know, it is that there is nowhere to go. There is not. The one thing about Brexit for the British people is that they seem to have a choice about how to vote. Nobody has a choice in the south of Europe, because if a major party even floats the idea that they might leave the Eurozone, it virtually creates a crisis in itself.
Thank you very much for your lucid presentation in support of the euro. I felt that Bruno Waterfield, I felt that in some ways it was kind of ideologically driven. You already decided the euro wasn't very good, and then you looked for all the awful circumstances in these countries to demonstrate. But there was no necessary demonstration that it was the euro that caused that. Those countries could well have got into that situation without having the euro. I don't think necessarily the euro was the causal factor.
Okay, so we'll take the panels. A lot of people asking or commenting on, what is the underlying problem here? Is it really the cause of all the phenomena that which we can see and has been described? Is there something in terms of the original structure of it which has created problems which wouldn't have existed otherwise? And following on from that, the second question there, or have errors been made along the way which have turned what was a good idea into something which has gone bad smelling? Yes. Okay, I'll take it in the same order as you began earlier.
Certainly.
Christian.
The question of whether the problems that the Eurozone faces now are intrinsically related to its own creation, or whether, having been created, it is unable to deal with the kind of crises and problems that it now finds itself facing, is a valid question, and we could go back over 10, 15 years longer to try exactly to figure that out. A couple of the points along the way that I think would go some way to doing that. One relates to something that Keith said in his very lucid defence of the euro. What you had to concede, Keith, is that if only its own rules had been followed, it may well be in a better condition now. But its rules were not followed. Indeed, its rules were and have been and consistently are broken and bent to a political will. Now, when I talk about a political project that is exacerbating the economic problems, and I come from a position where I don't agree with many of the political principles guiding that action. So we may differ, sir, on precisely that point. But its own rules have been completely distorted, which means it is in a far worse state than perhaps it otherwise would have been had there been more discipline on those rules. And it's, aside from rule breaking, it's something that Kwasi mentioned up at the back, that the interest rates, the cost of borrowing was so reduced that it became a drug. And the consequences of that inflated debt are now being borne out. And the only other thing I would say on the decisions along the way that have taken us to this point, and it relates directly to the gentleman from Portugal speaking with some experience of what it's like to live in a country that is being run by people elsewhere. I mean, many people in this country felt to a degree that that was the case, and that led to a large part of the vote to leave the European Union. But of course, we have no idea what it's actually like to have your elected government officials removed or replaced whatsoever. It's an extraordinary thing, and you can make a case, a philosophical case, or indeed just a pragmatic case to be okay with that. But I'm not okay with that. And the truth is that those kind of decisions are not without consequences. And some of those consequences are profoundly ugly in the rise of all sorts of political movements that perhaps otherwise would not have been granted legitimacy in Germany, in Eastern Europe, in Italy, and elsewhere. So there are serious social political consequences to maintaining this slightly mad approach to the Eurozone, the same approach which has led, as Bruno suggested, to a situation where its architects and proponents say there is no other option. You cannot leave.
Keith?
Yeah. I mean, let's be honest, debt is not nice. No one really likes debt. But who lent Greece the money? It was bankers, reckless bankers. And they were exposed. Their bank, if Greece had defaulted, it wasn't Greek banks would have gone down anyway, but it was German banks that were going to go down, it was French banks. And all we've done, of course, is we haven't bailed out Greece. As I keep reminding people, we bailed out French and German banks. That debt now sits with governments. So that's great. And we've allowed all these bankers to continue extracting their bonuses and high wage packets. It's nuts, okay? So we've got to think about what's going on in the system. And of course, Look, Greece actually did benefit from some of that money. But when you borrow money, you do also have a responsibility to use it productively. You see, there's nothing wrong with borrowing money and accumulating debt, so long as you actually invested in your economy and you don't waste it. And unfortunately, that went on. I'm not denying it. And that's shameful. But that, again, that's politicians not doing a good job for their citizens. So I think one's got to be careful. Where would Greece have been if it didn't have the euro? Well, I think you've got a country in Africa called Zimbabwe. Okay, and when you run big fiscal deficits and you're just free to print as much money as you want, well, I mean, it's an extreme example, and you end up with a worthless piece of paper. And that way, you're going to face suffering anyway. If you've been a pensioner in Greece and you're going to have 20, 30% inflation, that reduces your income, I can promise you. All right? So they had an opportunity to have a sound currency. The interesting thing is, when you ask for opinion polls, this hated thing that's caused all this trouble, even in the depths, the Greeks don't want to go back to the drachma. They prefer the euro. If you ask opinion polls in Portugal, yeah, this big failed project, but I've been told it's failure, well, you'd have 70, 80% definitely in favour of keeping it. Now, we're leaving, with a 52% mandate, leaving the, so this is pretty overwhelming support for the euro with citizens, real people. Lack of democracy. Well, look, with 70, 80% support and possibly higher, that's it. The Greeks, they don't like austerity, no, but they do not want to go back to these currencies. And I think we've got to remember that is a democratic mandate, to keep the euro and support it. Obviously, some of these problems get exaggerated. These economies are actually quite small. Greece, it's not the same as Germany's gone kaput. I mean, it's, you add up Portugal, Greece and Ireland, it's about 6% of the EU economy, the Eurozone economy. You could probably put all that debt with the Germans and we wouldn't even notice it. It would raise the debt to GDP ratio in Germany by about 15%, okay? And that'd still be a manageable debt. But of course, the Germans don't want to pick up the whole bill. And certainly, there has to be some demonstration in this system that if you have these big debts, you're responsible to pay most of it back. Let's be fair, they've been forgiven quite a bit of debt, the Greeks, an enormous amount. I mean, it's over 10,000 per Greek citizen has already been forgiven. So it's not as though we haven't dealt with this. The restructurings and the very low interest rates you get on the restructured debt means a lot of people have taken losses. So the idea that the creditors have just gone along and made no concessions. But of course, we can't afford to bail out Italy and probably Spain. These are too big. They're too big for Germany to put up with. Okay, so we can bail out these countries, but the point is we've got to, if you want to keep the zone together, you have to ensure that these big countries don't all go and it all becomes a free-for-all for debt forgiveness.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course, the debt forgiveness in Greece was effectively a transfer of private banking debt to public debt, which was through the bailout loans that we used to facilitate that transaction transferred to the Greek state. And people, again, showing, as you point out, this sort of one-way ratchet to banks. And this is, again, a really big part of the problem with the Eurozone's approach to the crisis. It has been very straitjacketed by very doctrinaire orthodoxies, particularly in the ECB. And the banking example is very, very good. So when Ireland, first bailout, when Ireland banks went bust and the Irish realised that they couldn't guarantee those banks because Ireland would be plunged into penury, Ireland said, well, we're going to have to write down that bank debt. We're going to have to restructure that debt. It means that the people who made those investments are going to lose money because they're in the Eurozone system of central banks. That decision was passed up to the ECB, and the ECB said, no, you can't do that. You can't write off that debt because you'll damage the sovereign signature of the Eurozone, because people will start to question, if they question Irish banks, they'll start questioning German banks. People are pretty aware of where these credit flows came on. So because of that orthodoxy, Ireland was forced into the bailout, and a particular character of the bailout was because these banks could not be allowed to fail. And notwithstanding Greece's well-known, notorious a tendency to massage its Eurostat figures and run up fiscal deficits and waste money, as it's seen in the ECB, that orthodoxy very much applied to Greece. The paradox is now that orthodoxy has changed completely. You're not allowed to bail out banks, you have to let them fail. Italy wants to bail out its banks because its economy can't cope with the impact, or they think, and it's presumably they know a bit better than the ECB. So this is part of the problem of the Eurozone. I think we should measure the Eurozone against the promises that it's made. Things like productivity are actually pretty important when you said it was going to go up and it actually goes down. One of the problems of the Eurozone is that it tends to straitjacket very different economies, really different economies, the difference between the economy of Greece and Germany within orthodoxies that may not suit them. So I think some of the austerity programmes that have been written for Southern Europe, Spain is a good example, have had, and it seems to be the conventional wisdom now, have had a negative impact.
Thank you.
I would like to pick up the point about the banks who lended the money. I think we have to decide at first who has the moral responsibility for this problem. Because does the moral responsibility lie on the person or the institute who borrows money or who lends money? So we have to answer that question first, I think.
Okay, so first I'd like to start my speech saying that I'm in favor of Europe. I think the principle of it is right. It was a political idea. So I heard that if Greece didn't enter the European Union, it will turn out to be Zimbabwe, a country just like Zimbabwe, in the sense that inflation will be increasing. They would have a low currency, so even more inflation. So my question is, did any of those countries, Greece in particular, had a choice to enter the euro? And so does it mean that we don't have a choice to enter and don't have a choice to exit it? And the second question would be to say, what are the conditions that is required to make Europe better, to make a Europe which is not necessarily controlled by banks? Because it feels like Europe has been created for a political reason, but banks are using it for their economic purposes, and which is the reason why those countries left. But just to say, I think UK really took advantage of you.
I think the question of why the Eurozone is failing and will fail is very closely connected to the whole EU project, which is also failing and cannot be separated, although they are different. And I think that you have to go back to look at why the EU and eventually the Eurozone were formed. They were essentially political decisions. Initially, instigated by France after the Second World War as a way of containing Germany. It was an attempt to Europeanize the German problem and to contain Germany, and then gradually developed into the idea of closer and closer union. Now, the problem that we've now got is that the dynamic towards closer and closer union has become so narrow and undemocratic and delegitimized that it cannot succeed. But the problem is that it can't continue to succeed without that centralization. So the common currency leads to the common market leads to a common currency. The common currency leads to a European bank. And then the European bank needs a European state. But the whole thing has been done entirely the wrong way round. If there was an argument for a United States of Europe, then that argument should have been made from the beginning, or certainly at some point in the process. And it has never been made. And so more and more people are resentful of the continually increasing powers of an essentially illegitimate body, which is the EU. And the Eurozone is probably the most unstable part of that because of the economic problems which the EU also has.
Thank you very much.
Professor Pilbeam, isn't the example you've just given us actual proof that a one-size-fits-all approach just can't work here? That you can't actually integrate, according to a common benchmark, economies with such radically different strengths, opportunities, and levels of productivity? And secondly, you talked about the Greeks there and about Greek democracy. Well, we can borrow one, can't we, from a fairly clever Greek, Aristotle. He asked a very interesting question about democratic behaviour. Is it the kind of behaviour you'd like to see in a democracy, or the kind of behaviour you need to keep one? And the problem I would like you to answer is how you think the situation in Greece is actually serving democracy, either.
I understand the kind of questioning about whether it is or is not a political project, but the historical record plainly is that it was a historical project and that everybody understood that it was a historical project, but masquerading as economic union, and that it was around the policy convergence where in the original Treaty of Rome, but also in the Maastricht Treaty, that all the different participants were basically coming to a similar point of view, and so found it easiest to compromise and coalesce around economic union in a way that they wouldn't have been able to reconcile a political union. And I very much agree with the person who just spoke on that fundamental misrecognition, dishonesty, as you might say. And I think that the real tragedy is that what we've built in is a very strong fatalism, where it could be the worst of both possible worlds, in that states are not taking responsibility for the problems that they're creating, but nor are they having the position of being able to address the problems that they're presented with, because the trajectory has been to lock in, as it's often described, to lock in a particular policy agenda, which is fiscal probity and low spending and a sound currency, where that might not necessarily be the right solution. And that's, I think, is the problem, is that it's a loss of governmental authority over the economy, which means that, say, Greece, I mean, we're picking on Greece a bit, they're never either in a position to confront the problems and to own them as their own. And you always have this kind of bad faith response, because that's, as it were, what is locked in with the euro.
Rather than looking at it as, is the Eurozone itself the thing that's created the problems, or is it actually blocking governments being able to do something about other problems, which, you know, obviously the debt crisis is not limited to the Eurozone. We've had a debt crisis all across the world, so the understanding of that is true. But is it the Eurozone prevents problems being resolved today, or is that one of its dysfunctionalities?
Perfect. Keith, my question actually goes to you as well. And with regards to what the gentleman in the black was saying earlier about how would it have been different had Greece not been in the Eurozone? Well, my understanding is that, and again, not an economist, I read the Joseph Stiglitz book on this, which I think is great if anyone's interested. But if Greece was independent and had its own central bank, they would have been able to adjust the currency, they would have been able to default if they needed to, and they would have been able to start again from day one rather than being dragged on for 10 years as we are doing currently. So I suppose the question is, why would this, when we jump to this situation that if Greece weren't in the Eurozone, it would suddenly be Zimbabwe, how is it any different to Iceland or, say, Argentina in the early 2000s in terms of being able to do that and kind of get back on its feet? And then I suppose, again, the risk involved in this project, when you consider that some of the economic gain to be had from it was lower transaction costs or, you know, getting rid of exchange rate risk, is that really worth the risk that we've put ourselves into? And I suppose I just kind of like a few thoughts around that.
Bruno, do you want?
Yeah, I think that even at the beginning, actually, there was a problem with the euro when you looked at it, which was its sort of partial political character, and the fact that lots of people predicted that when problems would come up, how would you deal with the fact that you have economies that are peripheral, not just geographically, but in the sense that they are poorer, without any system by which you could transfer money. So in a way, if you didn't allow Ireland to bail out its banks, but you'd had a transfer mechanism where the ECB could have helped ease that burden, then what happened in Ireland wouldn't have perhaps been so politically difficult, or Greece for that matter. It was also a bit of a problem that the targets and the monetary policy enshrined in treaties, which are rather rigid, were also always a bit biased against essentially Keynesianism. So you're ruling out, if you like, in advance, in a very doctrinaire legal way, some of the historically accepted responses to problems. And then, of course, the Eurozone is hit by a crisis. All of those problems are shown to be true. It is also shown to be true that that asset bubble came out of these, essentially the equalisation of credit rates, which people sort of knew to be a problem but wouldn't criticise because it all seemed to be going rather well. And right at the beginning, you don't have a difficult discussion about what the Eurozone is, why it's failing, what needs to be done. And this is really, again, well, I don't hide the fact that I do get quite angry about it, having followed it all the way along, is the inability of the Eurozone to take decisions. They still haven't taken a decision on Greek debt relief, and we're talking about Greece still paying off its debt in 2080. And this is a real problem I have with the Eurozone. Not only is it a bit of a straitjacket, not only is it sort of ridden by orthodoxies and it's impossible to change them, it's impossible to come up with creative solutions for different countries, but they really do seem unable to confront these difficult decisions because actually they are so unpopular. The Eurozone needs fiscal transfers to stop these inequalities building up between its member states, but that is utterly intolerable to the German Parliament, is utterly intolerable to the Dutch Parliament, is utterly intolerable to the Finns, who actually have put quite a lot of their GDP into Eurozone bailouts already, even though their editors were told it would never happen. And that's really, I think, my problem with the Eurozone. It comes back to this: there is no escape. It can't take decisions to make things better. You can't get out of it. And I think that's the real fatalism. And again, I say this with no schadenfreude at all. I think the fatalism in Spain, Greece and Portugal, which could well be facing another bailout soon, is probably the most depressing product of the Eurozone, where conditions seem to me to be pretty intolerable and people just don't see any other way. And that's a closure of politics and the imagination, which I find truly tragic.
Before we all get too depressed. Had a end you there. Keith.
I just want to remind people that, you know, someone mentioned the one size fits all. Well, productivity varies greatly within the UK. All right, we've got some parts of the UK are extremely productive compared to other parts. Unemployment varies greatly across the UK, and in the United States it's the same. I mean, so it is possible to have a single currency with great diversity. Make no mistake about it, because that is exactly what you've got in the United States. You've got massive diversity between some states and the others. But they do have some fiscal rules in the United States. Basically, each state will sort of try to balance its books. Each year, actually. It's a bit more restrictive than even the Eurozone. So they do have a mechanism. And Europe has begun to put in place. We realised the Growth and Stability Pact was not enough, 3%. And in fact, these countries, I'm sorry, when you've got huge debt, borrowing more money is not the solution to another debt problem. So all countries have to learn to cope with their debt levels, including the UK, by the way. We've got a debt problem, and we've got to learn to deal with it. Is it all to be forgiven? The answer is clearly no. Someone raised that point. Of course, if you borrow money, you've got a bit of a responsibility to pay it back. Now, I know that you get these occasional scenarios where a dictator's borrowed all the money, yeah, and then, and then the country goes kaput, and I do have some sympathy with that. All right, but when countries borrow money, they've got a responsibility to pay it back, of course. Greece would, interestingly, if it had its own currency, it would have just printed the money to pay back the debt, and you would have got a default through inflation. I mean, you'd have got your money back in drachmas, but it certainly wouldn't have bought you anything. The restructuring of Greek debt is actually quite immense. Yes, they've restructured it out to, 2080. Great, because that reduces your debt burden. The debt burden that Greece currently has is actually lower than many other countries, including the UK. The actual repayments they make each year as a percentage of GDP are lower than the UK.
When does that change again, Keith? Tell us the date when it changes again.
Well, I'm just saying that you say it's as though nothing was forgiven. And I've already mentioned over 10,000 per person. That's 40,000 per family. It's a huge forgiveness, and to say otherwise is wrong. Look, the pound we've got the pound in this country. Does that really determine my prosperity? Answer, no. If we had the euro, would we be much better off? I think we would, actually. But the interesting thing is it's probably not the end of the world. The piece of paper you hand over, so long as it's a fairly sound currency and well managed in itself, you know, what determines your success is your education. Why have you got large youth unemployment increase? It wasn't because of the euro. It's that the politicians mismanaged the thing. The elites all got jobs. People didn't pay their taxes. The kids didn't get the proper education and so forth. Don't blame everything on the currency. The idea that, you know, if you're free just to print away your money, you don't have to worry about your fiscal deficits, it's all wrong. Printing money, I mean, economics, we spent a lot of time learning that printing money doesn't, you know, it causes mainly inflation eventually and doesn't lead to prosperity. To be honest, I've been amazed at how flexible the European Central Bank has been. I mean, they're printing 60 billion a month now. I don't agree with this policy, by the way, the quantitative easing policy. And they've got further ammunition, if they need to pick up Greek debt under something called outright monetary transactions, which they've never actually used. It's in place. And that. So it's been amazingly flexible. Interest rates are rather low in Europe now. Yes, I think they did make a mistake at the start of the recession, and they were raising when they shouldn't have. But that wasn't the big cause of the recession. The big cause of the recession was, you know, failed bankers. That was the big cause of the global recession.
Thank you. Chris?
There's been a lot of talk about the role of the banks in all of this, and let me just say that I would be the last person to support bailing out of these institutions. But there was the policy that has been pursued. A couple of people in the audience have raised the question of whether the noble objectives of lower transaction costs or minimising exchange rate risks have been, you could say now, are worth the project. Is it worth the risk the project has presented to the people of Europe? And I would say no. It's not. Keith can talk about the level of forgiveness shown to Greek citizens. I doubt you'll find many of them expressing gratitude for the benevolence of European authorities these days. A country outside of the constraints and the ludicrous orthodoxies that are insisted upon from one country to another and one economy and one society to another, a country ordinarily has a range of options that it can use to confront economic circumstances, be it monetary, be it political forms of stimulus, methods of reform. If you are denied the use of these through the membership of an institution which is making you poorer, then you are just a passenger. And I don't want to labour a metaphor, but if a country is a passenger, the one thing that I think we can agree on in this panel is that there's no great certainty over the direction of that vessel. That is the problem, other than a desire to see it survive. Because there's also, as has also been mentioned in the audience, this is a deeply political project, and therefore it comes down to the grand ideas of men, and they are deeply flawed. I think that's the bottom line. So as for the points about where the moral responsibility lies in lender or borrower, I think that could be the title of a lecture here at this festival next year. I shall certainly ponder it.
Okay, out to yourselves again.
Are there any feasible resolution options here other than a United States of Europe?
To address this issue of how much responsibility the euro bears for the Eurozone's current economic malaise, I think it's clearly not the root cause. The main impact has been to mediate the nature of how the global cycle of the past couple of decades has played out. In the Anglo-Saxon economies, the US and the UK, what you saw was a massive run-up in private debt, in private asset prices, followed by a private liquidity crisis and a private deleveraging crisis. In the Eurozone, you also had that, and the Euro certainly exacerbated the fallout from that by necessitating strict monetary and fiscal policies, but it also overlaid that with a public debt crisis and a political crisis. And I think when you have that slightly more global perspective, when you look at the future of the Eurozone, it's natural to want to look at the internal structures of the Eurozone itself. I actually think the Eurozone now looks fairly resilient to purely internal shocks. I think the really worrying thing for the future of the Eurozone is what you think about the nature of the global economy. If you think the fallout from Brexit is still to come, if you think the US goes into recession next year, if you think the Chinese economy blows up, that's the scenario in which the Eurozone falls apart.
Okay, it's just a question about the sort of broader economic situation. You mentioned productivity rates, Bruno, in comparison to the United States. Well, obviously, the UK has appalling productivity. But compared to France and Germany, the UK productivity, I think the Treasury report, summer 2015, it's 30% below. It's staggering. So, although I get the point, absolutely really well-made points that you've made from the panel about the straitjacking effect of the euro, what political decisions can be made if perhaps you were to look at, or what decisions could have been made, so beyond sort of inflating your way out of problems and a bit of Keynesian spending here and there, given that the UK has fared so poorly outside of the euro, it's absolutely pitiful, what political decisions could have been made within the Eurozone?
So very quickly there, just on the ongoing enthusiasm for the euro in Portugal and Spain and the south, and I think you can't underestimate how much Greece has to kind of be there to teach the rest of Southern Europe how to take a thrashing at the moment. Because it really, I think everybody's accepted, Greece could have been bailed out rather cheaply, right? But it is there to kind of enforce moral hazard. And that's what people know. That's what they've really seen is, you know, if you really go against the straitjacket, you'll be in serious, serious trouble. And that's, of course, they want to keep the euro under those circumstances.
So you mentioned that obviously there's different productivities in the UK and the US, and that's definitely true. And obviously there were fiscal transfers from London to, you know, Wales or the northeast. But that's politically acceptable. People accept that there's some solidarity within that nation, and I don't think that's present in the Eurozone. And I think if you try and force it, that will cause a lot more problems. On the, you know, obviously if you borrow money, you should pay it back, but I think, well, lenders aren't lending out of the kindness of their heart, right? They want some interest rate for it, and so it's a risk. I think what people are saying in this particular case is that the banks lent that money at that low interest rate, knowing that there was actually more risk in it, but that they were too big to fail. So there was, you know, they were getting more out of it than they ought to have done. But the question I want to ask was, Bruno, because it's definitely true that there doesn't seem to be a way out. When the Greeks, Cyprus was first negotiating for a better deal, obviously the Greek people had voted and said, we don't want this deal. So he was trying to negotiate for a better deal. And at that point, the ECB, supposedly, you know, independent bank, shut the Greek banks down. Greek doesn't have a currency, so the only way it could get currency was to deposit assets at the ECB and get euros that way. And the ECB said, well, we're cutting that off. And that's quite a serious thing, so you kind of can't get out. You know, all the people who would want to get out, they're the ones who would be most financially damaged by finding a way out. So I'm left with this bind, because I completely accept that politically these transfers are unacceptable, and there are people who want to get out, but they're also the people who can't get out without, you know, really, really serious, the banks are closed, you can't do anything issue. So what will happen then?
Given the difficulties for people in Spain, Portugal, possibly Italy, Greece, how do members of the panel explain why people in those countries, apparently, most of them want to stay with the euro? How do you explain that?
Yeah, no, it's been suggested that the euro was a political decision, partly to do with French interests and containing Germany and everything. I mean, I wonder to what extent national interests have been completely included in this whole thing. I spend quite a lot of time in France, and the French budget keeps getting rejected by the European Central Bank. It's not just Greece and Spain, or these countries that are essentially held to account in this way. It's very much French national capital, the French state, which has that same relation. And French people, if you go to the local shop, will say everything was better under the franc, things were so much cheaper, and resent bailing out Greece and that sort of thing. So I think there's a way in which, is it the case that it's a political thing, or is it almost like the automatic result of the loss of national political interests and national political capitals, national kind of democratic structures? Because, you know, it kind of violates a basic principle of, certainly of the modern state, that the currency is compatible either with the state or with democratic representative structures. You don't get a currency, the currency of the Roman Empire is the Roman Empire. You don't get it in places that aren't the Roman Empire. So there is the unity of politics and economics, the political unit and the economic unit was well established. And so I'm kind of confused about why that was being broken at this time. And for me, it seems much more to be the almost like the euro being the reflection of the you know, almost like the reflection of the loss of politics and the depoliticization, the kind of pessimism that Bruno is talking about, rather than any kind of political interest going on.
I think that's a good point. I mean, in terms of the creation of the euro, German reunification was a really big factor, especially for France, and actually for others, including Britain, in order to sort of shackle Germany to make sure that Germany can dominate Europe again, in an attempt to defy reality. effectively. But before then, in terms of the ERM and some of the discussions, there was very much an attempt to depoliticise economics, to make it a effectively solely monetary policy, and as Thatcher called it, use the Bundesbank's spine, use Bundesbank, Deutschmark policy to set policy outside the control of the House of Commons, basically. So I think there was an attempt to depoliticise economics. I mean, even in the single market, I think that's a problem, because I think, politics, economics should be politicised. One of the reasons why there's a productivity problem in Europe and in Britain is because that political discussion about how national wealth is made, how much of it there is, etc., hasn't been had properly. Now let's look at the United States. Lots of people compare the United States to the EU in terms of currency. And I think it's a real mistake, because you have to look at American history. You have to look at the formation of the state in the United States, a modern federal state, from independence. It was protracted. It lasted a long time. There was a civil war along the way. Well into the 19th century, there were a number of currencies operating within the United States. If the single currency was an extension to the single market, it followed it in pretty short order of a decade and a half or so. So that's the point I'm making here, is before you could have the dollar as a successful currency, you had a federal state, fully fledged federal state, and already one of the most successful economies in the world. Now, moral responsibility between neither a borrower or a lender bin, all that kind of stuff. The real problem with the moral responsibility debate is these were all private transactions. These were all the financial sector benefiting from this amazing world where German bonds were worth, or Greek bonds were worth the same as German bonds. And the real problem was that responsibility for those transactions were shifted to the public budgets of the peripheral countries in the Eurozone, making them go bust, putting them into a sort of a bit of a death spiral economically. So, for example, Spain, before it had to rescue its banks, which had been swelled and bloated with all these credit flows from the rich north, Spain was the golden child, the wunderkind of fiscal policy, because it was running budget surpluses.
There was a point about the resolution, the sort of conclusion to this conversation, what then will be done. And I'm afraid I don't have much more to offer other than the figures I drew on in my opening remarks, which is that there are voices now who either were original architects of the project, now commentating from offstage, or those most deeply embedded in it at a policy level now, who recognise that further and deeper union will be the answer, will be the policy response required. My position is that you cannot pursue that totally distinct from democratic and popular support. It's a reasonably old-fashioned concept, I suppose, but that is the reality of it, and we see the consequences of pretending that you can pursue these kind of economic and monetary policies without popular political support. You see the consequences of that rearing its head across Europe. And Bruno raised the point of the United States about successful political union being a necessary precursor to any attempt at successful monetary union, and Europe has done it the other way around, and it is now living with those consequences. To go back to the opening question of this session about whether there is a future for the Eurozone, the answer is yes, there is, but it is one which is going to require far greater levels of political and economic union, and my proposition is that will require a monumental effort to ensure that there is popular consent.
Yeah, I mean, one of the popular ideas that I have a bit of support for is the issuance of what they call Euro bonds, i.e. that what we'll have is a sort of communal debt backed by Germany, backed by France and other members of presumably only the Eurozone. And this would enable countries, that get their house in order, but keep their fiscal deficits under control. Some of their debt, which obviously they pay a higher premium now, could be replaced by this sort of mutually guaranteed debt. And I think that's one way ahead. But it has to be done carefully. I can't go and suddenly say all the Greek debt is guaranteed like this. This is clearly not a clever idea. You need the Greeks to be on board. And to some extent, Greece has gone through a lot. And there are reason to hope, because, look, no economy wants to remain with 40 plus, maybe 50% of its youth unemployed, and with 23% unemployment. So there is scope for things to actually improve in Greece if, of course, they can get these people to work. Their budget deficits will come down, okay, because there's a lot of unemployed and that costs a lot of money. And, of course, you're not producing anything. So we may have actually passed the worst. Things can't get much worse than that. People forget that. Maybe the nightmare. And if we can get onto a more virtuous circle where more people are getting jobs, it helps the fiscal deficits, and maybe we could then also introduce Euro bonds as part of the solution. There's also moves for a banking union that are currently away. That should reassure depositors that their money's generally safe, and I sort of welcome that. So I think the fiscal compact is another thing which basically says, no, if you get low national debt, you can borrow a bit more than other countries. I think that's a sensible idea, actually. You know, countries that have got low national debts, and there's not too many now after the crisis, by the way, but if you've got sort of 60, 70% national debt, maybe you should be allowed to borrow a bit more than someone who's got 180%. And by the way, just one reminder, look, Greece is not actually bankrupt. A lot of people forget this. I mean, when you take out a mortgage, yeah, it's often 3, maybe 4 times your income, all right? And you get 25 years to pay it back, and most people pay it back, you see. And Greece's national debt, it is very high, and it's around 180% of GDP, but it's spread over a long, long time. In theory, you can pay it back. I promise you, Greece is capable of paying back that debt over a sustained period of time. It's not an insolvent country. But what we know with sovereign debt is there's a difference between, you know, ability to pay and willingness to pay. All right? And no one, you see, likes paying back debts. And, you know, it would be great if it could all be forgiven. But it's not actually a bankrupt country. You know, just as you're not bankrupt if you've got a 300% mortgage over your head. All right? So it's about putting your youngsters to work, thinking of how to spend public money effectively, not wasted on bureaucrats. Greece is still free, believe it or not, and as are the other countries, to allocate the budget. The argument is, can you run big fiscal deficits? The answer is no to that. But you're still free to allocate a bit more to education, a bit more. And in the background, by the way, the European Investment Bank has been approving lots of projects to help Greece out. It's part of the bailout, actually. It's never been more generous with some of the Greek things. You know, so Europe is actually doing much more than people know. You know, lots of projects have been approved by the European Investment Bank for go-ahead infrastructure in Greece because they realised that they were in difficulty.
Yeah, so I think I just want to clarify that it looks like there's a big diverging point of view in terms of how bad the situation is. But as far as I can tell, it looks like there's only one way going forward, which is an ever closer union. And so it's really the question more to Bruno. Is there really an alternative then? Shall we think about something else?
Great question for the panel to come back on.
Just a quick one. I'd just like to know the panel's predictions, their crystal ball predictions for 10 years' time in terms of how they would see things going within Europe.
What rules and regulations have been put in place to stop this happening again? What have we learnt? What measures have been taken? Because there's been a whole load of bad lending, but we know rules were got rid of, which enabled some of that bad lending. What have we learnt? What are we going to do in the future to stop this and learn from it? And how can we prevent there being huge resentment from the younger people in other nations where they feel they're being presided upon and their lives are being influenced and their ability to work is being affected by countries distantly?
Okay, thank you.
Just a question for Professor Pilbeam. I didn't understand your argument in terms of one way out of the crisis, you seem to be saying, is for all the European countries to agree to this Eurobond. But that Eurobond would accept the premises that the Nordic country will agree to transfer and pay, for example, the debt of Italy, which right now has got banks which are going bankrupt. At the same time, you argue that that's not possible because of the size of the debt of the Italian government. So aren't you kind of making a very contradictory argument here? Could the North really accept? Could it be capable of accepting to take over somebody else's debt? Because that has been an actually crucial debate within the elites.
He said structurally Greece hadn't devoted enough to education, which is why it can't get its young people into employment, which is why there's such high unemployment. But is it then not a little glib to say, oh, you could do a little bit of rearrangement here, despite the fact that you're already so overdrawn, in order to get people into education and therefore into employment? And as Bruno said, you know, Spain was a kind of star in terms of its kind of fiscal spending, so we've kind of used Greece as a bit of a punching bag here. But if Spain was in such a good state and is now in such a bad state because of those massive inflows and then cut off from the euro, isn't there still a structural problem there in countries that were actually really well behaved up until the crisis?
Okay, thank you all very much for your comments. Bruno.
Okay. For the future, what worries me most are the inequalities in terms of unemployment, particularly, but also in terms of the real wages as well, which are bouncing back much more slowly in the southern European countries. On Greece, I really recommend people can go find it on the IMF's website. Read the last IMF debt relief report. Now, the IMF tends to take the same kind of pills as the ECB, so their economic policies are usually wrong-headed, to say the least. And they do know a bit about sovereign debt and sovereign debt programs, and they are extremely pessimistic, and they're warning because the holiday for Greece on debt and interest, or on interest payments, ends at the end of a decade, and Greece will be spending around about 14% of GDP on servicing and paying back its debt. And the IMF are really worried about the country's capacity to continue doing that without some serious debt relief. Just finally, the Eurobonds is an interesting discussion because it really shows the problems here, because there are two sides on this debate. There are the sides of people who want Eurobonds but cannot accept, particularly the French, who cannot accept the level of discipline and interference in their country, particularly in terms of the French National Assembly being able to decide how the national wealth is spent. And on the other side of the argument is the Bundestag, which says under no circumstances are we going to give fiscal transfers to a country like France, where people are allowed to retire much earlier than the poor old Germans. So that the Eurobonds debate really epitomises the problem in terms of political union. And again, I really emphasise that whilst people might be fatalistic about staying in the euro, they're pretty annoyed about it, and in terms of their satisfaction levels with the EU, that is really beginning to change. Italy is extremely stark. I mean, I predict in 10 years' time that I think the euro will be smaller, and I just really hope that can be done through a proper political debate, through politics, rather than disorderly corrections or sudden events.
Keith?
Yeah, well, I predict the Eurozone will actually be bigger, okay, because one of the things you do when you sign up to join the EU is you accept that you will take on the euro. I mean, that's one of the conditions, and some countries still haven't done that. But it has gone up, actually, from the 11 founding members to 19. So it's actually got bigger. So something that's failed so miserably seems to have got bigger. I don't blame some countries for not joining immediately, but the thing is, the euro's going to be around because the politicians want it around and the citizens want it around. But you don't want to leave the euro because that will decimate your economy. Greece, for that reason, has stuck with it. The problems are not going to go away in the world economy. One thing we forgot is that a lot of these southern European countries were greatly affected by China. A lot of their problems was China joined the WTO in 2001 and suddenly took a lot of textile jobs and all sorts of manufacturing jobs from these countries. Now, that's globalisation, and that was going to happen with or without the euro. They continue to become less competitive because they acted as though I could still get 5% pay rise, whereas the Germans were just taking, 1 or 2% in line with their productivity. It causes no inflation. And that's why they became uncompetitive. So fundamentally, lots of problems we've got are going to continue. That, unfortunately, is the case with or without the euro. Inequality, distribution between old and young people, and ageing populations in some European economies like Italy, which again is the cause of productivity slowdown and part of that. Nothing to do with the euro. They will continue to age in Italy because they're not having enough young kids. So a lot of the problems we've got, I just want to separate, in the final, the euro did not cause all these problems. It actually provided these countries with a sound currency. And if they'd stuck with their national currencies, I suspect their plight would have been considerably worse.
Thank you. Christian?
To the point about why countries don't leave, given all that we've discussed, I'm not prone to quoting Greek Marxists, but I quite like Yanis Varoufakis, and so I will give him his credit. When he was talking about the Brexit vote, and he spent a lot of his time in the UK trying to argue against it, his position was that the only thing worse than staying in would be voting to leave. And I think that is a mindset of plenty of people. On the notion of a prediction of 10 years down the line, and I apologise for concluding this event in such miserable terms, but taken alongside the demographic pressures which Keith has touched on, the stagnant economies, the extraordinary social divisions which Bruno keeps coming back to, and the structural problems within the Eurozone, put it this way, the Brexit vote, in my opinion, will not be the only shock expressed via democratic will, hopefully democratic will, that the masters of this grand project experience in the years to come.
Thank you. So can I thank again City A.M, our sponsors? Can I thank the platform? And can I thank you?